course, darling, I can imagine no one can against me, so what are they gonna say? Of course, darling, they can say nothing. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna bury them all and I'm gonna give it them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me, so what are they gonna say? They can say nothing. Of course, darling, I'm gonna bury them all and no one can say nothing against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I had enough. Of course, darling, they are the whole time glancing you and then saying that they are gonna die soon and then you have to carry them. Of course, darling, but I wanna forget them. I don't wanna know nothing about them. I wanna shoot myself on the top of the mountain and forget about them. Of course, and if some of my kids wanna reincarnate and some of them I don't give a damn, they can try if they want, I don't care. Of course, darling, I had enough. If they wanna send them, it's their problem. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they can't against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that I'm giving you another option with my cage and with my 9 o'clock. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I know how to move. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that they are after me, but they can't.
Eureka Beats.
Of course, darling, they are always trying, but they can't against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I have everything I need. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I don't care about none of them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I got my own money. Of course, darling, and no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. So what are they gonna say? Of course, darling, they can't say nothing against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that they are the whole time trying to glance you and then say that they are gonna die soon. Of course, darling, and what can you do against them? Just nothing, just forget them. Of course, darling, and bury them all and give it them and forget about them. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. That is what I'm doing now. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me. So what are they gonna say? Of course, darling, they can't say nothing. So come on. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna shoot myself on the top of the mountain and I'm gonna give a damn. Of course, darling, and if some of my kids want to reincarnate in someone, I give a damn, darling, that is what you can have, that I don't care, they can try if they want.
Eureka Beats.
Of course, darling, if they want to send them, it's not my problem. I'm giving them other options with Emmy Cage at 9 o'clock. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, and no one can against me. Of course, darling, if they want to send them, it's their problem. Of course, darling, I'm giving them other options with Emmy Cage at 9 o'clock. Of course, darling, and I give it them. Of course, darling, I'm gonna bury them all. Of course, darling, they used to run motorbikes. Of course, darling, but I give it them. Of course, darling, I'm gonna bury him and all the motorbikes they are running. Of course, darling, that is what you can have. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that I'm gonna give you what you need. Of course, darling, forget about them. I'm gonna give you what you want. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that no one can against me. Of course, darling, that is what you can have, that I'm gonna bury them all and I give it them. Of course, darling, that is what you can see, that no one can against me. That I count my own money and everything is clean, everything is clear. Of course, darling, and no one can against me. So what are they gonna say? Of course, darling, they can't say nothing. Of course, darling, I'm on the top, and on the top I'm gonna stay, and no one can against me. So what are they gonna say? Of course, darling, no one can against me, and I'm gonna bury them all and forget about them.